Alright, so today we're going to learn about the relative pronoun in Latin. And the relative pronoun in English you most commonly see as who or which, or sometimes that. Let's begin by just taking a look at the Latin forms, and then we'll get into a sort of retrieval about what exactly a relative pronoun is in English by looking at some English examples, and then move on to looking about how we can then convert those relative pronouns into Latin. So let's begin by looking at these forms. Alright, so as normal, when we look at sometimes these irregular pronouns, we can be a little shocked. It looks like there's a ton of new forms to learn. But we're going to dive into this, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to remember or recognize these forms, a lot of which we've actually already seen before. So, first off, let's look at the genitive and dative singular. And we need to pay attention that QU stem, which remains for all the other forms, turns into a CU in the genitive and dative singular, going from qui to cuius. If you look at those endings, you might recognize them and compare them to another pronoun we've learned. Pause the video and see if you can think of it. Hopefully some of you got that it looks similar to is, ea, id, right? We have that ius, 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 aes, aes, aes ending, and then eyes, right? A in the dative singular, but here we have qui, qui, qui. So we've already seen that sort of weird genitive singular, dative singular combination. So that's the first thing we want to pay attention to. The other thing we want to pay attention to is that accusative singular is quem, rather than, so it actually has sort of like a third declension accusative singular form, rather than the second declension, which we might expect, given the fact that the rest of the forms that we're going to see are largely going to follow 2-1-2 endings. Keeping that in mind, the same sort of weird third declension endings mixed in are in the plural dative and the plural ablative. We have quibus, 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 which again we've seen as dative and ablative plural endings in the third declension. But it's kind of, so there's something weird going on here, right? Qui, qui, quod is almost like a hybrid of third declension and 2-1-2 endings. So we want to keep that in mind. Quibus, quibus, quibus in the dative and ablative plural. And then lastly, the final quirk is that neuter nominative accusative plural is quae instead of the qua that you might have expected. It's an AE ending, not an A ending, which is tricky, and you just gotta use it a couple times, get used to it, get used to seeing that neuter plural form as quae rather than qua. Alright, so those are the forms, and I would recommend studying them much like you study is, ea, id, by saying qui, qui, quod, cuis, 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 qui, 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 rather than studying down. It's generally easier because that way you can remember that they all have the same genitive and dative singular forms, and it will flow better. Alright, so now let's look at just how these forms work in English before I tell you how to decide just which qui, qui, quod form to use when crafting a sentence from English to Latin. Alright, so relative pronouns in English. Here are two examples. Pyramus loves Thisbe, who lives next door. The wall which separates Pyramus and Thisbe is thick. So let's see. There are three components here that I want us to be able to recognize. One is, what is the antecedent? What is the relative pronoun itself? And then what is the relative clause? So if you want to pause the video and see if you can answer what the antecedent relative pronoun or relative clause is of these two sentences before I tell you, that would probably be a good idea. Alright, so the relative pronoun in the first sentence is who. The relative clause is who lives next door, because the main clause is Pyramus loves Thisbe. So the relative clause is just providing us more information about the antecedent, which in this case is Thisbe. It's Thisbe who lives next door. So just a reminder that relative clauses allow you to tell more about another noun in the main clause. And in this case, the main clause is Pyramus loves Thisbe. and we're learning more about Thisbe. Alright, using that same information about relative pronoun, relative clause, and antecedent, see if we apply it to sentence number 2, we see that the main clause is the wall is thick. And this time, it's interrupted and placed in the middle as the relative clause, which is which separates Pyramus and Thisbe. So you ask yourself, well, what's separating Pyramus and Thisbe? In order to find out what the antecedent is, in this case, it's the wall. So you know the antecedent is the wall, and the relative clause is from which to Thisbe, and the relative pronoun is which. All right. So let's look now at a sheet with all these definitions on it. This is something that you can pause and read on your own. There's not really any more information to provide. I just want to give you definitions to reference as I use these. I'll be using these terms for the rest of the slideshow. All right. So now let's look at a couple more examples. See if you can find the antecedent for each of these relative pronouns. Alright, I'm going to go through them now, so if you want more time to practice, pause the video. Okay, so the ships is the antecedent of the relative pronoun which in number 1. And number 2, the student is the antecedent of the relative pronoun whose. In number 3, the soldier is the antecedent to the relative pronoun whom. So now, let's think about how can we take these relative pronouns in English and convert them to relative pronouns in Latin. And in order to do that, we need to decide, well, what is the gender, number, and case of these relative pronouns going to be? And so let's take a look at the rule here. So, in Latin, the gender and number of a relative pronoun match the gender and number of the antecedent, which makes sense because if I say the women who walk into town, it makes sense that who would have to be feminine and plural to match with the plural and feminine women of the antecedent. However, the case of the relative pronoun is going to come from its usage in the relative clause. So the case of the relative pronoun does not have to agree with the case of its antecedent. They can be two different things because the antecedent is performing one function in the main clause, whereas its relative pronoun may be performing an entirely different function in the relative clause. That's a lot of words, so let's try and give you some concrete examples now. Alright, so in sentence number 1, keeping that in mind, what would the gender and number of who be, given that its antecedent is Thisbe? Well, Thisbe is feminine singular, right, because it's the name of a woman. And so who would have to be feminine singular too. So if you go back to the chart of terms, the feminine singular is quae, so we would use quae in this sentence were we to translate it. But what would its case be? So I said quae because it's feminine singular. We're in that column. We're in this column, but we have to decide which one of these 5 feminine singular terms we're going to use, forms we're going to use. So if we go back to the sentence, we can ask ourselves, well, what is who doing in this relative clause? It's the subject of the verb lives. So I'm going to say, oh, well, it's going to be nominative because it's the subject of the relative clause. This puts it at odds with its antecedent, which if we look at the main clause, Pyramus loves Thisbe, and ask ourselves, what case is Thisbe going to be? We come with the answer, well, it's the accusative direct object. So even though Thisbe might be accusative direct object, the relative pronoun is going to be nominative singular, and so we'd use quae. And I know that was a lot of information, so let's walk through one more example here. All right, number 2. We start again by asking, well, what is the antecedent? What's its gender and number? The antecedent here is wall, which is murus muri, so it is masculine, and it is, in the sentence, it's performing the role. In the main clause, the wall is thick. It is the subject. So we know that this antecedent is a nominative masculine singular. So we can go to the relative pronoun and we can ask, all right, well, what is its gender and number going to be? I know it's going to match the antecedent, so I know it's going to be masculine singular. So again, I now have isolated the fact that I'm in this column here. I just need to find out now which case I'm going to use. And a reminder that in order to determine what case to use, I have to see what is it doing in its relative clause, which separates Pyramus and Thisbe. Yet again, it is fulfilling the role of subject of this relative clause. It's doing the action of separates. So we know that this is actually also going to be nominative. And so we'd use qui. All right. I would now encourage you to use these sentences to follow the same process to get familiar with how the case, gender, and number of the relative pronoun is determined in Latin. All right. And if you pause the video, you can work on that, and then I'll tell you the answers quickly, and we can talk about them more in class. All right. So I'm going to share the answers now. So number 1, which would be feminine plural, because navis is a feminine noun, and it would be nominative because in the relative clause, which lie at anchor, which is performing the role of the subject. Number 2, the teacher calls on the student whose hand is raised. Whose would be either masculine or feminine, depending on the gender of the student. And it would be singular because the student is singular. But if we look at that clause, we finally have a new usage. Whose hand is raised, whose is providing possession over hand. So whose would have to be in the genitive case. So we'd have cuius here. Masculine or feminine, singular, genitive. And number 3, whom, the general praise. Whom is referring to soldier, which is masculine and singular. So we know that whom is going to be masculine, singular. We are in the qui column of the relative pronoun. And it is accusative. So we are going to, in the relative clause, whom the general praise, it's receiving the action of praising done by the general. So we know it's the accusative direct object in the relative clause. So we can say it's accusative, masculine, singular. All right. So just moving on quickly, one final point I just want to make is here's a really useful chart for determining how to translate a relative pronoun. And here's how it works. You have your 5 cases, and you have 5 translations. And the translation depends upon asking yourself, well, what is the antecedent of the relative pronoun? The antecedent is a person, right? I like the boy who can dance well. Then we use who, but if the antecedent is a thing, I built the wall which is strong. The antecedent there is a thing, so we use which. And then we can just follow these translation patterns for how to translate the pronoun based off of what case it is. If the pronoun is accusative, we always know we can translate it whom. The pronoun is genitive, we know we can always translate it as whose. And just one small change I just realized is this should say by or with whom. That was my bad. All right, and we can talk more about this chart also in class tomorrow, but it's a very useful one to copy down to your notes. All right, I hope this helped. I know it's a little bit longer, but this is a complex issue. Don't worry if it's confusing. We're just started, and I promise we're going to do a lot more work and practice with it so we can get more comfortable with the idea before you're quizzed on it. Okay? All right. Have a great rest of your evening.